All right, everybody, welcome back to part 2 of this Firestore CRUD series. And so in the first part of the series, took care of connecting our Firebase project and our Flutter app, doing all the CRUD operations. So we built a service that handles all that stuff, built ourselves a model. And then in this one, we're just going to complete the app. This is going to be a very simple journal app where you can enter a journal entry for any date that you choose, and then we'll have a list of it to display on the home page. So before I fire this up again, I did just want to take care of the packages that I'm going to want for this application. And one I'm definitely going to want is UUID. And so we'll go to installing, we'll grab the dependency here, and we'll paste that into pubspec.yaml. This one allows you to create a unique identifier for your Firestore records. Firestore will do that itself, but then you have that extra step of having to go get that record ID. So if you generate it on the client side, then you can kind of dictate and have that stored in the record as an identifier in the record. You can also dictate that that's going to be the document reference, and so those are all synced up, and you only have to make a set call rather than set it and then go get the ID and then put the ID back into the record. So that saves you a few reads and writes on the database. The other one we're going to get, or another one we'll get, is provider. So we'll use provider as our state management system, and I'm going to use change notifier provider. So we'll grab installing, grab the latest version of that, paste that in here, and we'll use change notifier provider just to store the temporary values until we save the record. I'm going to use something called date format, so we'll have a date picker here, and this is my favorite package for formatting date times in Dart. So it's date underscore format. And then lastly, I'm going to grab Google Fonts because I just want to add a little bit of style to the fonts in the application. So we'll grab Google Fonts. All right, and then I'm going to go ahead and boot up the application. All right, so that's our app too far, not too exciting. So let's go ahead and give ourselves some screens. So in our SRC folder, I'm going to create a new folder called screens. And there's going to be 2 screens in the application. So we reviewed this the first time. There'll be a home page where there's a list of entries, and then there will be an entry page where there's an opportunity to add a new entry or to edit an existing one. So we'll create a new file called home.dart, and we will create one called entry.dart. And a home is just going to be a list, so a stateless widget will be just fine for us there, and we will call it home screen. And we will import material. All right, and instead of this default container here, we want a scaffold. And let's give ourselves just a simple app bar with a title, which is a text widget that says my journal. For a body, let's just leave that blank for now, but we do also want a floating action button, so that will be how we add a new record, and that will take us to the entry page. So let's set a floating action button, child, and we'll do icon and the old icons.add. And onPressed. Let's just leave that blank for now, but that's going to be when we navigate to entry. So this isn't showing on the screen. That's because in our app, we have created a home, which is just a scaffold here, and that was a temporary measure. So let's replace that with home screen. All right, there we go. Let's create our entry so that we can navigate. We could click this, navigate, and navigate back. So at least shell that out. So for the entry, let's go ahead and just at least start with a stateless widget, and that will be an entry screen. And likewise, we don't want to return a container, we want to return a scaffold. And for now, we want to have an app bar with a title, and we'll just make that text my entry. And that should be enough for now, because that will give us the option of going here and then popping back. The app bar will give us a back arrow. So let's go back to home, and now that we have a destination, let's go ahead and put that into our floating action button. So in this function, we will do navigator of context.push and material page route. And we will give it a builder with a context that goes to entry screen. All right, we should at least be able to bounce back and forth now, and we can. All right, so this is going to have a list of entries on it, which is going to be kind of meaningless until we have some to display. So let's move on to the entry screen, and let's just flesh this out just a little bit more before we move to our middle layer. And then we'll have some data, and we can circle back here and start to make this more meaningful. But what I'd like to have up at the top of this bar is a date picker, so that if you come in and this is a new entry, it will default to today's date. But you can pick a different date. If you were, making an entry for yesterday because you forgot, or you're going back and doing one, or if we're editing and you want to change the date, you'll be able to do that through the date picker. So let's take care of that. So here I want to give myself some actions, and we'll do an icon button. And we'll go ahead and do icons dot calendar today is what we'll do. And that's going to require an onPressed. So let's open up a curly brace there. And what I'd like to do here is have a function that we will call underscore pick date. And we'll give it a context. And let's come down here and actually build that function separately. So what we're going to do is we're going to get a future date time back from our date picker. So we'll create a function called pick date. And we'll pass in a build context. And this is going to be our final date time, which we'll call picked, is going to be the result of our date picker, which is asynchronous. So let's mark this async. And what we're going to do is await show date picker. So this is part of the Flutter platform. And so it needs a context. That's why we passed in a context here. So we'll give that. It needs an initial date, and why don't we just do datetime.now for starters. First date and last date is the dates that you can range back to. So let's just do a new date time for 2019, and we'll let you pick ahead. If you want to go ahead and stock up your journal until 2050, we'll let you do it. What the heck. All right, so people could cancel this. This could be null. So we'd say if picked does not equal null, then we're going to return picked, like that. All right, because this is a future, then we want to go .then get our value. And we're going to want to do something here eventually, but for now, we'll just print value. And oops, I did that all on the wrong widget. Sorry about that. Hopefully you caught that, but you probably didn't. So let's just move that out of here. Let's see, I'm just going to grab actions. We'll cut that, move that over here to entry. And let's see, I need to cut a comma there, and let's just move this out. Save that. And there we go. Got that all straightened out. My deepest apologies. It'll never happen again. Probably not true. And if I pick a date, we should see it down here and the time, so that works. Cool. All right, a couple more things we can do before we proceed to the state management is we can actually put our box here, our save button. So let's see, we've got a scaffold here, we've got an app bar. Let's go ahead and add the body. And the body is going to be a list view. And that list view will have some children, and the children will be text field. So this will be where we enter our journal entries. So let's do a little input decoration on there. So let's do a label text of daily entry. Let's save that. I don't really want that underscore, so let's get rid of that with border input border dot none. And I want this to be bigger than one line. This is a journal entry, so there should be some, some bigger space here for writing. So let's get outside of the decoration and let's do a max lines of 12. And let's say a minimum lines of 10. All right, then below our text field, let's do a raised button. This will be our save button. So we'll have a child with a text widget that says save. And we'll do style. We'll do a text style. And we'll do colors. Let's make the text white. And on press, we'll just leave that blank for now. And let's make the color of the button itself, let's make it that nice accent color that we had. So we can do theme of context dot accent color, which I have set to pink, I believe. There we go. I don't want this going all the way to the edge, so I'm going to wrap this list view with a little bit of padding. And I'll just go ahead and leave the default at 8. If you want to mess with that, feel free. All right, and let's copy that raise button, and down below let's put a delete button. So instead of save, we'll have delete. And let's actually make it, instead of our accent color, let's just make it colors.red so it's pretty apparent it's a delete button. And let's do one more thing before we leave this for now. Let's give ourselves an optional pass-in. So if we're coming in here for a new entry record, then we just want to start with a blank screen. But if we are picking one that already exists, then we want to pass in that information. So let's have an option to pass in a entry. So we'll do final entry, and then we'll do a constructor for our entry screen, which will have a name parameter for this .entry. And we'll need to import that. And so what we can do off that is that if we're coming in with an existing entry, then we're obviously passing in this value. And if we're passing in nothing, then that means it's an add. And the delete button would only be appropriate if it's an existing record. So for our button here, our raise button that has delete, we can actually come in and do a conditional argument on that. So we can say if widget.entry, or actually we would say if entry is not equal to null, then let's see this raise button, and otherwise we can just do a blank container. You can't do nothing, but a blank container is more or less equivalent to that. So this is what we'll see when we enter a brand new entry, but if we come in with an existing record, we'll have that delete option down there, which is the behavior that we want. All right, I think we've done all on the front end that we can for now, so I'd like to proceed to state management. So inside the SRC folder, let's create a new folder called providers. And in that providers folder, we're going to create an entry provider.dart. And that will be class entry provider with change notifier provider. So we're going to mix in, or excuse me, just change notifier. We're going to mix in change notifier. All right, so what are we going to need in here? Well, we know we're going to want to connect to our service here. This is going to be the intermediary between our view and our service. So we're going to want an instance of our Firestore service. We know that. We are going to need temporary private variables to store the data that we are working with. So our date, for instance, and our entry. So let's create a private datetime variable of date and a private string of entry. We may want to have a private instance of our entry ID. And I know at this point we're going to want to use the UUID package, so I'm going to say we'll create a var UUID equal to UUID like that. All right, so these are all private variables, so we're going to need a public way to get them. So we'll set ourselves up with some getters here. So we'll do a datetime get of date, and that will point to underscore date. We'll do a string of get entry, which points to entry. And we are also going to want to get a stream of entries, which we set up here. So this will be for our home page, so we can get a listing or a stream of the list of all our entries, so we can display those here. And so we can actually do that by saying we're going to get back a stream of list entry, and we can call that entries. But we can get those straight out of our Firestore service, get entries. And let's import that model. That's the way we want to do it. That decouples the view from the service. We can access from the view. We're going to ask for entries from this provider, and it just contains a reference to our Firestore get entries. All right, we don't really need to get this entry ID. We're just going to need to set it here inside of our provider, so we don't need a public getter for that. We are going to want ways of setting these, and so we can use the set keyword. Not my favorite syntax on this, but I do like to just kind of mix it up a little bit in these tutorials. So I'm going to use the set keyword. People also yell at me when I don't use the set keyword. All right, so when we do change date, we're going to set the date like that. Now that would be possible to do in an arrow function, which would be nice, but because we're using change notifier provider, we can't do it all on one line because we also have to notify listeners like that. And this is why we are using private variables here, because without calling notify listeners, nothing is going to tell the UI to change. So if this change date gets called, the date is changed, and notify listeners is called to tell the UI to refresh. If this were not private like that, we wouldn't need this getter. However, anybody could reach in from any class and get this property and set it, but nothing would happen because the notify listeners wouldn't be called. So this is why we have private variables, and we force the change to go through this process here so we can notify the UI of a change. All right, let's change our entry as well. So we'll have a string and we'll call that entry, and that just does the same thing. That should look pretty familiar if you are a Java developer. All right, so let's say we come into the entry page and we are coming off of an existing entry. So we have one here, we click on it, and it takes us to this page, and we have values on the screen. The provider would need to know about those values. So let's create a function. So we'll create a section for functions. Let's create a function that is load all. And we'll pass in the entry we're getting from the entry screen. So when we come in here, we'll call the load all function, pass it whatever we're getting here. And so we'll say if entry does not equal null, so in this case we've got an existing value, then we want to update these private variables with whatever we just got passed in the widget, because we want those two to remain in sync at all times. So our date would then become datetime.parse entry.date, because remember, when it comes out of Firestore, it is an ISO string, so we'll just simply parse that to datetime. Our entry will be equal to entry.entry, and our entry ID will be equal to entry ID. So that's an existing record. Else, if we get a new one, then let's say our date is going to be datetime.now, right? So if it's a brand new record, we want the date to be defaulted to now. Our entry, we will set that equal to null, so that's going to start blank. And our entry ID will also be null. All right, so that's a function we can call whenever we come in here to bring this into sync with what's on our screen. We're also going to need a save function. So when we click save, we've got a function to call. So let's do save entry. All right, and so this is either going to be an add or an update, and doesn't necessarily matter to our Firebase function, but it does matter to us here because we need to generate an ID if it's an add. So how we can tell if it's an add is we can say if our entry ID equals null, that's an add. Else, edit, right? Because the entry ID on an existing record will be passed in, and this will have a value. So if it doesn't have a value, it's an add. All right, so we'll create a new entry variable, which we will call our cast to an entry here. Our date will be date to ISO 8601 string. Our entry will be equal to our entry. And our entry ID, so this is where we're going to generate our ID. We'll just use version 1. All right, and that is our entry, so we can call our Firestore service, and we can say set entry, and we can pass it that value, and it will add it. All right, so look, we've got this a generated ID, and if you remember, when we go to upsert, we are going to take that entry ID and we're going to use that as our document reference. And if that document reference doesn't exist, it's going to create a new record. If it does exist, it is going to just update the record here. So that's why we auto-generate an ID the first time. That becomes the document reference. It gets stored in the record as an ID as well, so we can grab it either way. All right, and so the other case is that we are having an updated entry. And so this is going to be roughly the same thing. I will copy it, paste it in, except in that case, we wouldn't want to generate a new ID. We would just want to use the entry ID that we've been passed so that we're updating the record. And so we want to go to Firestore service, same thing, set entry, and pass it that value. All right, and the only other function that we would want to have in here is eventually we want to be able to call delete. So let's do remove entry. And if you recall, in our service, we take in the ID as a string there. So we want to pass in our entry ID and call Firestore service remove entry. Remove entry, entry ID. And that is it. All right, so that should be it for our provider. Now we can start to wire this up to our front end. So let's start an entry, because until we actually add something, we're not really able to do much on our main screen. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change this from a stateless to a stateful widget like that. And the reason I'm going to do that is that if we're getting a value into the entry, so this is an existing record, we're going to want to load the value to here. And we're going to want to do that with a text editing controller. And if you read your documents in on flutter.dev, text editing controller should always be disposed of when you are finished with it. So we will use the stateful widget to maintain when it should be disposed of. So we have our build method here. So above that, I'm going to create a final entry controller, which will be a text editing controller like that. All right, and then I'm going to create a dispose method here. And I'm going to do entry controller dot dispose. All right, so now I have a controller and I have a method for disposing it. If we are coming in with an entry value, then we want to initialize all this data. We want to pass it back to our provider as well. So an init state would be the best place to do that. And we're going to do all that with our provider. So let's bring in our provider. We'll do a final entry provider equal to provider, and make sure we get that imported of context. And we want to specify that this is of type entry provider, and make sure we import it. All right, and anytime you bring in a provider like this in a init state or dispose, you also want to pass in listen false. All right, so we are just using the provider in this case to locate the entry provider widget in our tree, which if we look in our Dart DevTools, and we can actually see that our provider is nowhere to be found, and I think that's because we forgot a step. I forgot a step. So come on out here to the app, and we need to come out to the material app here. So app.dart, come to the material app, wrap with a widget, and let's wrap that with a change notifier provider. Make sure we get the provider package in there, and we want to create context goes to entry provider like that. And let's see, I don't think that'll update my widget tree unless, oh yeah, there we go, I can refresh it. Okay, so now I have a change notifier provider at the top of my widget tree. And that means back here in my entry.dart, now I'm able to use this provider to reach up from the entry screen and get those values from change notifier provider. All right, so I've got this single instance of this entry provider here, and so what I want to do is load this up with my values if it is an existing record, and of course just kind of blank load it if it's a new record. So let's look at widget.entry. So now that it's a stateful provider, if I want to access this entry, I need to reach up with widget dot. And so I can say if that does not equal null, then we are edit. All right, and so one thing I would want to do is take my widget controller, my entry controller dot text property, and set it to widget entry. So if I have an existing value pass in here, then I'm going to do that. That takes care of what's on the screen, but what's actually in our state management system, we would need to update that, and we wrote a function for that. So we reach into our entry provider and we say load all, and we pass it widget.entry, and it will take care of loading up all the values here. So that will keep our backend in sync with what's going on our screen. And that's all we need to do on an existing record. And for else, so this is an add, we need to do even less because we don't need to set the entry controller.text because it's null by default. But we can do our entry provider load all and pass it null. Because if you remember, when we said it's null, go ahead and set this date to today and set the entry and the entry ID equal to null. All right, so heading on down here into our build method, we are going to want to get the entry provider here because we're going to want to pass changes. We're going to want to call save. So let's get an instance of our entry provider here. And because this is the build method, we do not want to pass listen false. We just want to leave it like that. We want to listen to this entry provider. And I do need to specify what type it is, of course, which is an entry provider like that. All right, that'll take care of that error. So now when we come in here, remember we're loading up the values in a init state. So we've just got my entry up here, but that would look a lot better if we had the actual date at the top. So in place of my entry, let's take that out. And let's move this down to the next line. All right. And in here, let's use our format date package. And our date is going to be entry provider.date. So that's today on a new record, or if we're coming in on an edit, that's whatever date was in the existing record. This format date is a little simple, but I like that about it. So it's just going to take an array that it's going to just mash together. So this will be our month. And I'm going to stick some spaces in between here. So every time I do a comma, it mashes this together. So it's just going to mash in a space there. I'm going to do a single D. I'm going to do a comma and a space. And then I'm going to put the year in there. And let's go ahead and restart the state, because when we came in, all those values had nothing in them. And because we didn't have the init state, it didn't get a chance to load it. Whereas now, when it comes in, we get the init state and it loads today's date up top. So that was just a function of making changes on a stateful widget, and it didn't get a chance to fire this init state because we were sitting on it when we made the change. Okay, when we pick the date, we are currently just printing it. But we have this great list of functions on our provider, one of which is .changeDate. And so we can set that equal to the value that we're getting off the date picker. And we are reading that value up here. So in theory, if we were to go and change this date to the 11th, we will see the 11th here, because this is listening to the changes. And when we make the change, that value changes with it. Beauteous. All right, so when we make an entry, we do want that should be a space in between there. The entry should update the value in the back end as well. So we can just do onChanged and say we're going to get a string value from that. And when you do, call entry provider.changeEntry and set it equal to our value. We have a controller property here, so we want to assign that entry controller we created to here as well. And we can't see much here. We're gonna type, and for now we're just gonna hope it's updating in the back end. Our raised button, we have a blank entry here. So when we go to save, now we should call entry provider.saveEntry, and we should also pop back to the home screen. So let's say navigator of context.pop. And if our delete button were visible, we would want to remove the entry at this point. So we could say entry provider remove entry, widget entry ID. So we're just going to get the entry ID off of the entry that was passed in, and that would also want to pop the context. So I'll just copy that and put that there. So at this point, if I come in, I should have today's date there. I should be able to change it if I want to, and I should be able to make a journal entry. And when I click save, our entry provider.saveEntry should fire. Every time I make changes to, well, first of all, our date is already set in the back end to today. If I were to make a change, it should sync with that. Whenever I make a change here, this onChange method is sending it to my provider, and when I click save, all those values should be loaded up to the private variables, and they will be passed to Firestore. So let's test that. Let's check here in the console. You probably have to hit refresh if it's the first of a new collection. And there it is right there. Good. Maybe I'll do one more, and I'll just try changing the date to yesterday. Click save, and don't have to refresh that time once you got the collection going. All right, so now we got 2, so that will make it more interesting if we want to actually create the entries here on the home page. So let's switch here to screens home, and let's finish out our list view that will display our entries. So let's start by getting our provider here in build. So we'll do var entry provider equal to provider of context, and want to make sure we specify that we are looking for entry provider in our widget tree. All right, so for our body, we just have a container, so obviously that's not going to fly. Let's do a list view, and let's do a list view builder. And we'll want an item builder and an item count, and our items are going to come from our entry provider, and we have a stream set up here with a list of our entries. So let's give ourselves a stream builder by wrapping list view with a stream builder. The object we're going to get back is a list of entry. And just make sure I get 2 closing braces there. The stream that we're going to use is entry provider should be. And I'm trying to get in the habit of using final on those. Entry provider dot entries, like that. And so our count is going to be snapshot data.length. Our item builder is going to be context/index, and then open up some curly braces. And what we'll want to do is return a list tile. And let's do a trailing, which will be an icon, icons.edit. And a title, which will be text. And this will be our date. So let's use our format date package. And we're going to want to pass it snapshot.data bracket index dot date, and our format is going to be space d comma space and then y, because I think we need a closing parentheses there. I think my parentheses are off. Let's see, we got text, and that closes there. We got list tile, that closes there. So far, so good. Yeah, okay, this is a string, so we want a date time, parse that. And let's see, now I might be short a comma. Oh dear. That was it. Missing semicolon. Nice. All right, let's format that up so I can't do that stupid mistake again. All right, so here we go. We got these on there. Let's add a little color to the edit. We'll do our accent color, so theme.ofcontext.accent color. And so we're good there, except that when we tap on these, nothing happens. This is our add button, but we want to be able to tap on these. So let's come to our list tile and let's do an on tap. And we'll do navigator of context dot push material page route builder context. All right, and this is our entry here. And I think we need to entry screen, and we need to get that imported. All right, now remember, if we are passing in, so I think if we click on this now, it's just going to be like an add. If we want this to go into edit mode, we've got that all set. We just need to specify the entry that we're passing in, and that is snapshot.data index. And in theory, when we click on this, it should load up with our entries already, which it does. And also we have the option to delete. I don't think we hooked that up. Oh, we did. All right. So that is all set. So we should be able to edit that like that, have it retain that. And if we want to delete it, we can get rid of it like that. All right, I think there's just a couple more loose ends we want to tie up. So let's do today's entry there, and then let's do another one for yesterday, just restore what we had there. All right. Yesterday's entry. All right, so I think if we do, let's see if we cancel. Yep. So we are going to get an error if we cancel our builder. So in entry.dart, or our date picker, where we pick our date, which is up here, we just want to check if the value does not equal null. Then we want to set that value. Otherwise, we don't want to do anything. All right, so let's try that again and cancel, and everything's fine. All right, the other thing though is if we are on October 11th, you'll notice that our selected date is October 12th, and that's because in our date picker, we are just doing datetime.now for the initial date. And that worked fine on our add, but if we're editing, then that doesn't make any sense. So let's go ahead and pass in date time initial date. And instead of date time now, we should do, actually no, it would make sense, instead of date time initial date, if we pass in our entry provider and just pulled the date that we had set here initially as the date. So when we load all, we are either setting the date that we have or date time today. So if we dip into our entry provider and grab that, that would make the most sense. So let's pass in the instance of our entry provider. And for our initial date, let's do an entry provider dot date. And that's going to break up here. And we just want to pass in entry provider. And I think if we cancel out of that, then when we click this, we should get, yep, the 11th is picked there, and the 12th should be picked there, and it is. Great. All right, now we did bring in Google Fonts, so we could add a little bit of scripting here. So let's go to app.dart. And let's just add ourselves a little bit more of a handwritten theme in here. And so for our text theme, I'm just going to pass in Google Fonts, and you can go to Google and pick out anything you think is appropriate, but I'm going to use Patrick Hand Text Theme. Like that. And now we've got a little bit more of a handwritten look to the whole thing. So, all right, that is the app. So we did the CRUD operations last time. This time we were able to hook in some state management, hook that into our services, our CRUD services that we had created, and then we created the screens for the upfront portion or the view portion of the app, and it's all tied together in those nice 3 layers. So hope you found that helpful. If you did, please like, subscribe. We've got plenty of content going on this channel, and hopefully we will see you in the next video.